Hello, I'm Jo Duke. I've been interested in material history for over 20 years, weaving and researching for about as long. I work with a variety of looms. I started weaving cloth in 1996 on a 16th century style floor loom and taught myself how to use the warp-weighted loom when I joined the Dark Ages Recreation Company in 1999. Recently, I've been focused on the traces that the type of loom might leave on a fabric. So the key questions for the next 15 minutes are: can the loom type be determined based on the textile remains, even small fragments? And if so, what features are the most useful to look for? Is it possible to tell if fabrics were woven on a vertical loom or a horizontal floor loom by any pattern or defects in the fabric, by the spacing between threads, or in the shape of the selvage? Let's start with the language of the loom. Warp threads run the length of the cloth. They form the initial web on the loom before the weaving starts. The weft is the thread that is woven into that web. Right to left goes the weft. The warp is tied to beams at the top of the warp-weighted loom or at the front and the back of the floor loom. The heddles are the moving parts of our weaving machine, string or wire loops around each thread that make it possible to weave without lifting each thread individually. On the floor loom, they are normally fixed top and bottom into a frame or harness. On the warp-weighted loom, they are tied to a single rod that can be lifted into forks or supports. When this rod or harness is lifted, the gap is called the shed. A big clear gap is a better shed, making it easier to weave. A beater is used to keep the weft straight and can be used to pack each row tightly against the one before. On the warp-weighted loom, I use a wooden sword beater. Floor looms use a reed. This is like a comb, but normally closed, top and bottom. Originally, they're made from plant stalks, actual reeds, but now, more commonly, they use thin metal rods. The word ends is used to refer to the density of the warp. How tightly spaced are those threads? Pix counts the density of the weft. How tightly is it packed or beaten into place? Draw-in happens if the fabric is not given enough weft. When the yarn turns around to make the next row, it pulls the warp threads so that they cannot lay parallel or straight. Can you see the pinch on the top right? The combination of fibres can give you a woven pattern. The simplest weave is a plain weave or tabby. This has alternating threads, one warp, one weft. If you look at just the single fibre, it will be up, down, up. Twill has a progression of adjacent threads, giving a diagonal line on the surface, sometimes changing direction. This is a 2-2 twill. The orange weft goes over 2 brown threads and then under the next 2. Standard blue denim is a 3-1 twill. On the front, you see the blue warp as diagonal ridges, and on the inside, you see the white weft. The same with this 2-1 twill. On the good surface, you see mostly brown warp, and on the back, you can see the white weft goes over 2 and then under 1. The warp-weighted loom is believed to be the main loom for cloth production in Northern Europe prior to the 12th century, with continued domestic use in remote regions until the 19th or early 20th century. Hoffman's study of loom weights dates this loom back to the Neolithic age and charts its spread across Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean. So let's look at how it works. The warp is tied to the cloth beam at the top of the loom. The warp threads are tied in bunches to weights at the bottom to keep tension. These might be custom-made clay weights or a collection of rocks of a similar weight. Each shed is tied by string heddles to a moving rod in the middle of the loom, except for one shed that is set on the lower fixed beam. Fabric is woven above the string heddles and the weft is beaten upwards. Long pieces can be woven, starting with excess yarn gathered up on rocks at the bottom and then winding the finished cloth about the beam at the top. The horizontal loom began to spread across Europe in the 12th or 13th century. Warp threads are tied onto the back beam. The finished cloth is wound on a second beam near the front. These beams control the tension and store excess length. The harnesses are in the middle of the loom. Each warp is threaded through a small loop in a string or wire heddle. The shed is changed by foot pedals. Pulleys lift one harness and lower the other. The weaver sits at the front of the loom. The fabric is woven towards the weaver and the weft is beaten forwards using a reed, often swung on a hinge. These 18th and 19th century looms are known as counterbalance looms because of the pulley mechanism. This is essentially the same mechanism as the earlier horizontal looms. My loom is a Leclerc jack loom. This is a 1970s design. To investigate any loom traces, 3 different types of cloth have been woven using each of the 2 loom types. Linen samples used a coarse hemp linen. This piece started 50 centimeters wide with noticeable drawing 2 centimeters over the first 14 centimeters. On the warp-weighted loom, this is a one-way process. Once the cloth gets narrower, it is near to impossible to make it wider again. By the time the cloth was 64 centimeters long, I had a drawing of 6 centimeters. There is some variation in the spacing of both the warp and the weft as you look over the whole piece of cloth. The lowest density of warp occurs between loom weights. These are unintentional, but possibly could be avoided with better technique. The most noticeable gaps are about 3 or 4 millimeters either side of a single warp thread. The second linen sample was 12 inches wide. The warp was set up with the same 20 ends per inch, and weaving naturally created a similar 8 picks per inch. I used a 10 dent reed, meaning each slot is 1/10 of an inch, and I had 2 warp threads in the same slot. The trace of this is not highly visible to the naked eye, and the weave from the floor loom is much more even than the warp-weighted loom. The red wool used for the next 4 samples was selected as close to the fibres in many of the Viking Age head coverings found in Dublin. The drawing was much less here than on the linen, only 5 millimeters in a length of just under half a metre. The warp for this plain weave was weighted with 8 pairs of weights, leaving gaps that are clearly visible at 2 centimetre intervals across the fabric. Loops of the weft yarn can be seen at the edges. A similar piece was woven on the floor loom. The reed maintains parallel lines in most of the warp, and only at the selvage is the warp distorted by the tightness or irregularities of the weft. This was woven at 16 ends per centimetre, still using the 10 dent reed. This is 4 threads per dent, and the texture of the woven fabric clearly shows this. The density of the weft varies with how gently one beats the reed, and though I managed to weave sections at 3 or at 12 picks per centimetre. It doesn't take much skill or concentration to keep the weft parallel. A 3-1 twill or a 2-1 twill has a definite back and front. Generally, the side that shows more warp is considered to be the front, but the easiest way to weave a 3-1 twill is from the back. So when you are lifting, only about 1/4 of the warp threads are being lifted at any one time. On the warp-weighted loom, you can maintain a constant tension by keeping the same number of threads on each weight. For this piece, I again used 16 weights in total, but with the 4 sets going backwards, only 4 sets of weights across the loom. So, as you split the warp into more sheds, the bundles of thread on each weight is wider in the fabric, giving gaps at 4 to 5 centimetre intervals. Also, by slightly offsetting the weight change, I could significantly reduce the gap. The warp here again was 4 ends per dent in the reed, but the trace of that is less visible compared to the pattern of the twill weave. The tension of the weft appears to stop the fabric from lying flat, giving an interesting curl at the selvage. This is an older project woven as part of public demos at Upper Canada Village. The aim here was to make fabric for hats, so changing the weft approximately every 50 centimetres. There's a lot of drawing on both pieces, slightly less on the second piece, and some of the efforts to rectify that were successful. You can see a few places where there is a slight increase in width. This was my first piece on the warp-weighted loom. It's a 2-1 twill, lifting 1/3 of the warp on each rod. There is no starting border, but there is a top selvage of a sort. The warp threads were doubled over and suspended from a cord. You can see gaps in the warp where this cord was tied to the loom. The drawing on this piece was large, 14 centimetres over the 2.1 meters, and a major part of this occurred in the first 30 centimeters of weaving. The warp was originally set at 6 ends per centimeter. After the initial drawing, it became more stable, or with experience, it was easier to maintain the width. This was a great learning piece. Rigid heddle or tablet weaving used for bands and belts can also be used to set up the warp for the cloth loom. This stabilizes and spaces the warp, allowing it to be sewn or tied to the top beam. Without a woven band, the warps can be suspended from a cord. These starting borders were studied in detail by Hoffman. If you ever see a starting selvage, that could prove the use of a warp-weighted loom. 2 signs that might denote a warp-weighted loom. Possibly regular but widely spaced gaps associated with loom weights, or warp threads that converge along with drawing on any surviving selvage. Whereas fabric is more likely to have been woven on a floor loom if you see regular, closely spaced gaps associated with the threading in the reed, and parallel warp threads in the middle of the cloth, regardless of any pinching at the selvage. Absence of these might show a finer reed or a more experienced weaver. Thank you for your time and interest. I hope that we meet again soon in either the Q&A later today or maybe one of the other weaving forums.